Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. In order to understand Israel, it's important to understand Israel's relationship with its neighbors, particularly Israel's relationship with Egypt. In this episode, we're unpacking the history between Egypt and Israel, their fighting, and their attempts at peace. So, Josiah, let's start at the very beginning of the relationship between Egypt and Israel. Let's start at the very beginning of this modern state of Israel in 1948. So can you just give us a little rundown of the history that happened between Egypt and Israel in 1948?
Sure. So in 1948, that was sort of the War of Independence, as Israel referred to it, or there's other names for it as well. First Arab-Israeli War, things like that, depending on your perspective. But this was the war in which Israel had to fight both the local Arab community as well as most of the surrounding Arab countries for its independence starting in May of 1948. The war for Egypt really did not go as planned. It had some pretty serious consequences, and those consequences really put Israel and Egypt on sort of a collision course moving forward. Even though Egypt essentially lost the war, it did have some long-term implications that would lead to more wars being fought between Israel and Egypt. So some examples of what happened essentially are why these long-term implications. Number one, Israel survived. So it really was not supposed to happen that Israel survived, even though Egypt did hold on to some territory. I say that Egypt lost because the goal was the destruction of the new Jewish state, that it wouldn't survive its war of independence. And the fact that Egypt, allowed or had to acknowledge the fact that Israel survived was an embarrassment. It refused to formally recognize Israel for several decades, and there would be more wars fought to try and reverse this outcome that Israel survived the War of Independence. But again, it was a major embarrassment for Egypt. And the second thing is that the armistice line, again, Egypt did hold on to some territory, and the armistice line gave Egypt control of an area known as the Gaza Strip. It's obviously in the news quite a bit in recent years, and this area was under their control for decades. Egypt assumed control of a little under around 200,000 Palestinian refugees at the time, and it did not annex the territory. It did not choose to assume permanent responsibility for it or make it formally a part of Egypt. It occupied it instead as an external territory outside of its sovereign borders with a military governor. And the reason why, presumably, is because it intended to return the Palestinians after Israel was eventually destroyed. So, again, Israel wasn't supposed to make it through the war. When it did, even the territory that Egypt held on to, it didn't formally annex it because the goal was to basically eventually come back to this in a future war, destroy Israel, and then disperse the people that it had assumed some temporary responsibility for. The outcome in which they had to do this, assume control of these refugees and dance around the fact that Israel existed, but they couldn't formally recognize it, was really so embarrassing that it led to the collapse even of the Egyptian monarchy. And that would have some pretty serious effects on the internal constitution of Egypt, or the way that it itself was governed. So by the early 1950s, you have this secular military government of sorts that was in control, and they were led by a man named Gamal Nasser. He was known for being very pro-Arab nationalism, really kind of the socialist form of Arab nationalism in a lot of ways. It was a secular ideology that encouraged unity among the Arab states, this idea of pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism. And it really shared, especially in Syria, this authoritarian nature and hatred of Israel. So Syria and Egypt kind of became these natural allies that would later then form the key parts of the axis that comprised Arab nationalism and resistance against Israel.
Yeah. I think you were talking about the Gaza Strip being in the news so much recently. I think when we think about the Egypt-Israel relationship, it's so easy to only focus on the current things that are happening now, but it's really important to understand the context of what happened in 1948 and what continued to happen.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about Nasser. I wanted to ask you, how did Nasser's new role in Egypt shape the relationship between Egypt and Israel moving forward?
So you have to understand, I think, some of the history as well of what's going on in the Middle East at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So in the early 1950s, you're already into the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. So the Middle East, like many other parts of the world, was already sort of this playground for this proxy conflict that's being fought between the US and the Soviet Union for control, especially over critical resources in the Middle East, oil being a prime example. And Nasser enters the stage with this already having been sort of set. The ground was already set for this conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, this being played out through the different countries in the region.
Yeah.
And he arrives with this sort of Arab socialist nationalist agenda and is going to immediately begin taking some steps to try to move Egypt in that direction. His preference was going to be a little bit more for opposition to the West, and especially Europe, and moving a little bit closer to the Soviet Union or their model of governance. So this led to the nationalization, for example, of the Suez Canal, which sparked some pretty severe backlash. So the Suez Canal was a project that was funded in part by French, British companies. They maintained some control over the operations of the Suez Canal, but it was a major financial opportunity for Egypt to assume control of this and collect the various fees that are required to go in and out of the Suez Canal. And it was also an opportunity to generate a lot of leverage, because what made the Suez Canal so remarkable was it allowed, it's like the Panama Canal. I mean, it allows you to bypass massive amounts of time, or avoid massive amounts of time spent shipping goods or in getting them from point A to point B for trade purposes. It would be very difficult to suddenly go back to the way that things were prior to the Suez Canal, when you had to go the long way around, so to speak, around Africa. And so it was really very lucrative for Egypt to take advantage of it, but they were losing a lot of money because they were under control of European companies. Yeah. So he decided to nationalize it and bring it under the control of the Egyptian government. Now, if you can imagine how lucrative it was for Egypt, it was already that much so for these French and British companies. They were very much against this. They had a lot of economic and financial interests also at stake. And in 1956, Israel sort of agreed with the French and the British that Nasser was a threat. The French and the British because he had nationalized the Suez Canal and was threatening to use it for Egypt's purposes that may not be in the interest of France and Britain. Israel because they already understood that Nasser was making threats about Israel's destruction, so they had their own reasons to dislike Nasser. And they agreed basically to work together to try to defeat Egypt and bring the Suez Canal back under the control that it was previously. And they did that. They very effectively were able to immediately win some victory over the Egyptian forces. The problem is that it backfired when the US and the UN exerted some significant pressure and forced Israel, France, and Britain to leave Egypt and also return the Suez Canal to Egypt. So Nasser won the Suez Canal, and his hatred of Israel deepened pretty significantly as a result, because Israel hadn't invaded Egypt because of the Suez Canal. It was just a convenient arrangement with these other countries that also had reasons to dislike Egypt. Israel's concern was that Nasser was threatening Israel. Yeah. But it didn't really matter. Like he chalked up the war Nasser did to this sort of colonialism that France and Britain were engaging in, trying to control the Suez Canal. And he blamed Israel for taking their side. And it really deepened his mistrust of them and desire to destroy Israel.
Wow. So we've talked a lot about the 1948 war, and Egypt's role in that war. So I want to kind of move down the timeline of history now and talk about the 1967 war.
Right.
So in 1967, Israel fought a major war with multiple Arab countries. Can you tell us a little bit about what Egypt's role was in that war?
So Egypt is Israel's side of the story is that Egypt is going to be blamed for starting the war, essentially.
Yeah.
Egypt is going to argue that Israel launched the first attack in June of 1967 and that they're the ones that sort of started the Six-Day War. Israel's argument is that they only launched that attack in June of 1967, which we'll get to in a moment, because of actions that Egypt had been taking in the months prior, which were viewed as hostile, potentially even as acts of war. So there was a couple of things that were playing out. One, Egypt had sort of expelled or forced out UN peacekeepers that were in the Sinai Peninsula. So this is the part of Egypt that borders the Gaza Strip and Israel. And there were peacekeepers there previously to sort of keep the 1948 armistice in place and protect the peace, but Egypt kicked them out and said, you need to leave. It also began to mobilize and put more of its own military equipment and troops in the Sinai Peninsula, which is a hostile thing to do. I mean, it basically is turning your back on the 1948 armistice or ceasefire and saying that this is no longer valid. We're keeping the people out who are supposed to enforce it, and we're putting some of our own military in their place.
Yeah.
Now, the second thing that they did is that they enacted a naval blockade, which prevented Israel from accessing international waters through the Red Sea, very simply. And that was a big deal for Israel because that is, again, economically very harmful, financially very harmful.
Yeah.
And it's viewed by Israel as a hostile act, as a threat, a form of coercion, even as an act of war. And Israel decided that they were going to launch the first direct military strike on Egypt in response to that. So what they did is that they launched a preemptive strike in June of 1967 on both Egypt and Syria, who were closely aligned and working together on some of this. Syria had also been firing periodically from the Golan Heights into the Galilee region of Israel, which was a lower altitude or lower elevation, I should say. And Israel is responding to both of these countries, engaging in these different hostile acts by launching preemptive strikes. Unfortunately for Egypt and Syria, the preemptive strikes were very effective. I mean, brutally effective. They essentially, destroyed the Egyptian Air Force in a day, essentially.
Yeah.
And the Syrian military was also damaged significantly as a result of this preemptive strike. And it immediately turned the tide. Wars tend to be longer than 6 days, but this was a 6-day war because Israel's first strike was so effective. And it gained massive territory. Israel gained the Gaza Strip from Egypt. It gained the Sinai Peninsula. It gained the West Bank from Jordan, who incidentally also joined the war after it started. Probably a mistake on their part, but Jordan also fired at Israel after the war started, and so Israel attacked Jordan and gained the West Bank. And it also took the Golan Heights from Syria, the elevated position that Syria had been using to fire at Israeli agricultural communities in the Galilee. So it took all of these territories, and it effectively what it did is sort of crushed this dream that they would be able to destroy Israel. And up until that point, they'd been living for these Arab countries for almost 2 decades with this assumption that Israel's existence was temporary. At some point, there would be a big war, and they would destroy Israel. They would then be able to do what they want with Israel's territory, and they would be able to remove from themselves, in Egypt's case, this temporary responsibility for these hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that they didn't want responsibility for.
Yeah.
All that disappears in the 6-day war because not only does Israel survive it, but they gain massive amounts of territory in the process, and all of a sudden they have to face the prospect that Israel's not going anywhere.
Yeah. It's quite fascinating to realize how much land was acquired during a 6-day war.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's astonishing.
I know. It's really crazy to think how much happened in 6 days. It's not even a full week, 6 days. It's crazy. So I want to talk a little bit now about how this 1967 war influenced Israel's relationship with Egypt, because we know that Israel got the Gaza Strip back from Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula. So how did that influence the relationship moving forward in history?
Well, it didn't create any more mutual love for each other, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So it was not a positive. It did solidify Israel's standing that it was not going to be easily destroyed but it didn't lead towards peace,
Yeah.
I would say. Nasser died in 1970, so he wouldn't see the next war between Egypt and Israel, but he was basically a ruined man. He was very depressed after the results of 67. Egypt, again, was thoroughly embarrassed by the outcome of the war, and it knew that it had to fight back again to retain its territory. It had to fight again, not just because it wanted to destroy Israel, but because it had lost so much territory that it was going to have to fight another war if it wanted to get that territory back. It lost a significant chunk of its own territory in the Six-Day War that was part of sovereign Egypt. So there was always an understanding that there's going to be another war again after this. Israel felt very confident about the results of the Six-Day War. The fact that it managed to gain that much territory in 6 days suggested that they were, militarily speaking, very superior to their opponents. But the problem is that led inside Israel to, I don't know if apathy is the right word, but a sense that they were invincible, that they couldn't be defeated.
Yeah.
And that was almost a dangerous level of assumption on their part, because in 1973, on Yom Kippur, the Yom Kippur War happens, and Egypt and Syria attack. In this case, they attack first, not Israel. And I mean a direct military strike where they enter Israeli territory with tanks and things of that nature. And it was bad. I mean, Israel was in very dire straits and required some emergency assistance from the United States in order to win that war. It was devastating to Israeli society. The assumption was, when the war started, I mean, people were preparing mass graves and preparing themselves for the worst. That this could be devastating, and this could be it. I mean, Israel might actually be destroyed if Egypt and Syria were able to carry out their objectives. And it completely upended this idea that Israel could rely on being secure. It wouldn't have to be very vigilant.
Yeah.
It was in some ways very similar to what happened on October 7 and after October 7, Israel realizes maybe it assumed too much about its own safety and about its own abilities to keep itself safe, about their enemies and their abilities or willingness to fight Israel. And now Israel's more concerned with safety than it was prior to October 7.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the 70s, it was the same way. Israel changed significantly, that it became much more concerned with its safety and much more skeptical that it could do whatever it wants, militarily speaking, without there being some consequences. So there was a significant investigation afterwards, obviously, to sort through all of these things, all of these really tough questions that were being asked. The important thing, I think, for our conversation to note about sort of what happened in the relationship with Egypt moving forward was that Israel did fight back. It eventually managed to hold on to the territory that it started the war with, including the Sinai Peninsula, but it was very costly.
Yeah.
And it put Egypt's new leader, a man named Anwar Sadat, in a much better position moving forward.
So let's talk a little bit about Anwar Sadat. Who was he?
Yep.
What did he accomplish? What did he do? And why is he significant in this discussion about the Egypt-Israel relationship?
Well, he's the man who replaced Gamal Nasser. So that in and of itself is significant.
Yes.
He was sort of the new leader of this Egyptian government, and also in some ways the inheritor of the legacy of Arab nationalism. He was maybe a little bit more pragmatic about things than Nasser, which we'll get to in a moment. But he was the successor to Nasser.
Yeah.
We have to start there.
Yeah.
He managed to, in 1973, prove that Israel was not invincible, that it could still defend itself, but that it wasn't going to gain massive amounts of territory in every war that it fought, that Egypt could fight back a little bit, at least. He was, like I said, more pragmatic and certainly accepted what Nasser could not, that Israel was never going to be totally defeated. But it also made his point that it might be more beneficial to make peace in the long run than to keep fighting these wars indefinitely, and that Israel was going to also incur a cost, not just Egypt, if they kept fighting these wars indefinitely. He also believed that the alliance with the Soviet Union was not necessarily going to be best for Egypt long term. That they didn't need to have an alliance with just the Soviet Union. Maybe they should also expand their relationship with the U.S. He started to move things forward in that direction. And the combination of trying to expand its relationship with the United States and also having come to the realization that Israel wasn't going anywhere led him to start the process of trying to figure out, okay, maybe peace with Israel is actually in Egypt's best interest moving forward. Maybe we need to recognize the right to exist and try to make peace. And he actually was quicker on that than even Israeli leadership at the time, who were very skeptical because of a very costly war that they had almost just lost and they'd been surprised by. So they were pretty suspicious of Egypt. But he sort of made some of the first moves and even flew to Jerusalem to speak to the Knesset directly to Israel's parliament and make the case for peace between Egypt and Israel in 1977. That was a big deal at the time. An Arab leader flying to Israel to address the Israeli parliament directly and acknowledge its right to exist ask for peace it's huge. I mean, he was a really, really amazing person who accomplished a lot in terms of making peace between Egypt and Israel. And in 78, they did. In 1978, Egypt did make peace with Israel during the Camp David Accords. But it was unfortunate that he probably gave up a lot in the process. It's unclear the exact conditions that led to it, but he was eventually assassinated. And more than likely, his overtures to Israel played some role in that. He gave up a lot for peace.
Wow. So we've kind of in the timeline of history, we've gone through a period of really intense fighting and no peace between Egypt and Israel. To then all of a sudden there was this breakthrough deal in peace, which was the Camp David Accords.
Right.
So I want to learn a little bit more about the Camp David Accords, what they were, their significance. So can you share with us a little bit about that?
So the Camp David Accords was the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. It was sort of mediated by President Jimmy Carter, and some of the negotiations took place at Camp David. That's why it's referred to as the Camp David Accords. And it laid out a few concessions on both sides that would be made in exchange for a mutual recognition peace deal between Egypt and Israel. So Egypt got the Sinai Peninsula back, although it was supposed to be demilitarized. And more on that a little bit later, maybe, that the exact degree to which it has been demilitarized is debatable. And there's a few different things going on there, which make it a little bit complicated. But Egypt did not want Gaza back. So it did want the Sinai Peninsula, and it got it. It did not want Gaza back, and insisted that Israel deal with it instead, which I think is very significant for a couple of reasons. One, it demonstrates that Egypt was never very concerned with the Palestinians that it was governing in the Gaza Strip. It didn't really want to be responsible for them. And we know this because it didn't formally annex the territory in 1948 and because it didn't want them back, responsibility for them back after 1973 war. So it basically said, Israel, you have to keep this. For Israel, unfortunately, that was a very consequential decision long term because, as we know, that made Israel responsible for the welfare and the ultimate fate of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Now something like 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. And it's been ever since a hotbed of conflict and terrorism and other issues that Israel has to deal with. So that was a very significant outcome that it was not included in Israel's concessions to Egypt that it gave it back. Rather, or I should say, the concession was not giving the Gaza Strip back. It was Israel keeping it. That was something that Israel had to concede to Egypt, but still, very significant.
So now I want to talk a little bit about how Egypt's politics have evolved recently and how this impacts Israel. Now, I know we could probably do a whole video on this, but just give us a summary of the politics of Egypt and how that's affecting Israel.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting to follow. I think what's interesting about Egypt is that it was the first Arab country to make peace with Israel. So on the one hand, you have a lot of positives to celebrate. about the relationship between Egypt and Israel because they led the way, so to speak. And now you have other examples, like eventually Jordan in the 90s, you have the Abraham Accords. They were more recently signed. So there does seem to be some sort of positive trend or momentum in terms of peace being made between Israel and Arab countries. And Egypt gets some credit for being the beginning of that trend. On the other hand, it was not very popular.
Yeah.
So the average person in Egypt is not a fan of Israel. And there is still some distrust between the two sides. Even though there is this formal peace agreement, it's more of a sort of cold peace. It's not a very warm, friendly peace. It's more kind of like we do this to get along sort of thing. And that has certainly led to some challenges. If you consider some of the internal politics of Egypt as well, there's some interesting developments, I think, that begin even before Israel was on the scene, but continue to be relevant today in terms of understanding why this sort of uneasy relationship between Egypt and Israel. So let's go back to the 1920s.
Yeah.
Brief rewind, if you will. In the 1920s, Egypt started to have an issue with an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. It was originally an organization started to advocate for social and religious reform. It was not necessarily immediately involved in politics, although eventually did become involved in politics and sort of challenged this secular government, especially when Egypt became this secular, socialist, Arab nationalist government. It started to get more involved in politics and challenging the government. And it has over time generated spin-offs in several other countries around the Middle East. So most of them are going to be political parties or social organizations that exhibit some Islamist or extremist tendencies. Hamas is actually a former chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood that left the Muslim Brotherhood and became an independent organization, but it was born out of this organization. So even before Israel was founded, Egypt has been dealing with the roots of this strain of very extreme Islamist organizations that tend to morph into something that can be somewhat ugly.
Yeah.
It during the Arab Spring was confronted by that directly when Egypt sort of, I should say, the previous regime fell.
Yeah.
During the Arab Spring, Muslim Brotherhood came to power, and for a brief time, Egypt was being run by this Muslim Brotherhood under an Islamist government. And that had its own challenges as well. The previous regime certainly had many issues, which is why the protests broke out in the first place, the revolution in Egypt. The new government had its own unique problems as well, and it was eventually displaced by another military government. So today, Egypt again has a military government, but that history of the conflict between so-called secular and more Islamist streams of thought or Egyptian society, and the amount of power that the Egyptian government has to hold and try to maintain in order to suppress the other strain of Egyptian society is extreme in some cases, and it leads to what can be a relatively ineffective government. So practically, that means that you have more secular, autocratic governments, typically speaking. It means that the Egyptian economy is relatively underdeveloped. It relies on a lot of patronage networks, meaning that you buy support from people by offering them money or jobs or contracts, even if they don't deliver on the value that you would expect for that amount of money or jobs or whatever. But you're really not paying them to do the job. You're paying them to support you.
Yeah.
It relies on a lot of that. It relies on a lot of foreign assistance. It relies on some corruption, unfortunately. There is a lot of military funding from the U.S., who has an interest in seeing Egypt be stable, a stabilizing force in the region, and not overthrown by terrorists. But it also struggles to control a lot of different organizations that are more influenced by Islamism.
Yeah.
So you have offshoots, for example, of Al-Qaeda, or you have ISIS, frankly. It was operating in the Sinai Peninsula for a while. And you had to sort of figure out how to control them. And the Egyptian government has struggled with this to a certain degree, figuring out how to control these different organizations, even with the military support that it gets from other countries.
Yeah.
You also have smuggling networks in and out of the Sinai Peninsula
Yes.
or in and out of the Gaza Strip through the Sinai Peninsula that it has a hard time controlling.
Yep.
So there's a lot of challenges that it faces because of this concern with internal security, but also these organizations that exist in opposition to the Egyptian government or Egyptian state. It is a very challenging set of circumstances that Egypt finds itself in, which at times can create some tension with Israel.
Yeah. So kind of as we're wrapping up this conversation today, I want to talk about the present. So I want to learn a little bit about the disputes that have happened between Egypt and Israel since October 7th, 2023, which was Hamas's attack. So can you explain some of these disputes and kind of what's going on there?
Right. So we've already referenced this a little bit, I think. Some of the challenges that Egypt's politics have created or posed in terms of leading it to struggle with its own internal security, and then as a result, leading to some tensions with Israel in response to that. I'll give you a few specific examples. So smuggling is a big one. Smuggling in and out of Gaza is a major concern for Israel because that's how Hamas gets a lot of its money. It's how it gets people in and out of the Gaza Strip. It's how it gets weapons, in some cases, in and out of the Gaza Strip. And there are examples on the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip where tunnels were dug that you can drive a truck through.
Oh, yeah.
There's videos. You can look it up online of people driving a truck through these tunnels. So it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And for Israel, it creates a lot of conflict because it wants to see Egypt do a better job of controlling those smuggling networks. At the same time, it doesn't want to see Egypt putting massive amounts of tanks on the Egyptian side of the border near Israel, because then it looks like maybe Egypt's planning to invade Israel again. Yeah. So there's this strong tension between these two priorities that Israel has. And again, the challenges that Egypt is facing do complicate things pretty significantly. You also have conflict over whether or not Palestinians should leave the Gaza Strip. Egypt does not want any Palestinians.
Yeah.
It gave up on them a long time ago. In 1948, it refused to annex any territory, but maintained the Gaza Strip as a temporary place that it had control over so that someday it would no longer be responsible for Palestinians. In 1967 and 1973, again, it abandoned responsibility or rejected responsibility for this issue. So there's no reason why Egypt would accept any responsibility for Palestinians moving forward.
Yes.
And every time that Israel suggests something like, okay, we have to carry out this war on the Gaza Strip, it would really help if Palestinian civilians were not in certain places where we're trying to fight Hamas.
Yes.
Maybe some of them should leave and go to Egypt. Egypt always says no, because we don't want Palestinians.
Yes.
So there's a lot of political conflict over issues like that. And then, like I said, just the general state of uneasiness that is created when you have a peace deal that is based not so much on friendship, but a reluctant recognition of the other's right to exist. It creates an uneasy peace, if you will.
Absolutely. Well, the relationship between Egypt and Israel has been historically very complex and stays that way to this day. And really, Israel's relationship with each of its neighbors can be very complex. So if you're wanting to learn more about that, definitely check out our video about Israel's neighborhood. We kind of go through and unpack the relationship between all of Israel's surrounding neighbors. And if you're looking for more resources, be sure to check out the description for things you may find helpful. If you have any questions, be sure to leave us a comment below and we'd be happy to answer you. And if you're looking for more content related to Israel and the Middle East, be sure to follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.